Hi everybody, my name is Lexi Davis. I'm the Natural Resources Educator here at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Yates County. And today I'll be talking about tree ID diseases and care, and that's just a little part of my job. I also focus on lots of things having to do with water quality, invasive species, and other things like that. But for today, we'll focus on the tree stuff, which is arguably my favorite part. Okay, so for today, kind of just an outline of the presentation, we'll start with some tree identification basics. You'll basically be botanists after this. And then we'll go into some common trees, their common diseases, and some general care practices for those. Okay, so first, we're going to talk about branching. So this is one of the key characteristics that we look for when we're first identifying a tree. So first we have alternate branching. So this is when the branches, leaves, and leaf scars do not grow directly across from each other. So if you're making the shape with your arms, your hands will be alternate one another. So this includes species like oaks, cottonwoods, cherries, birches. Most of your trees are usually alternately branched. And then we have whorled. So this is when 3 or more of the branches or leaves originate from the same spot on the branch. So if you hold your hand flat, it's like your fingers around your palm. So this includes mostly your coniferous trees, so your pines, spruces, and firs. And then next we have opposite. So these are when the branches or leaves grow from the same spot on the branch or the stem. So if you're doing it with your hands, they originate in kind of like a V shape. So this includes species like maples, ashes, and dogwoods. And one of my favorite acronyms to remember this is madcap horse. So all maples, ashes, caprifoliaceae, dogwoods, and horse chestnuts have opposite branching. Those are the only trees that have that. So madcap horse. But you can just remember mad because we don't really have caprifoliaceae or horse chestnut really around here. Okay, so moving on to the leaves, which are the more easy part to distinguish. So let's talk about some morphology first. So on the left, we have a silver maple leaf. So this has sinuses, which are those deep impressions, which would be like the creases in your fingers. And the tips of the fingers are what we call lobes. The stem that's holding the leaf is what we call a petiole. And then the outside of the leaf is what we call a margin. So this margin will be either smooth or have teeth, which are called serrations, or they will just be smooth, and that's what we call entire. So that's what you see on the right in that picture. And the middle center vein is what we call the midrib. Okay, so this looks a little scary, but we're gonna walk through it. So there are 2 types of leaves. You can either have simple leaves or you can have compound leaves. So looking first at the simple leaves, this includes a single leaf blade with a bud at the base of the leaf stem. So 1 leaf per petiole. So like I said before in the original picture, we have either entire, so no lobes, or we have like maples and oaks that have those sinuses or deep impressions. Okay, and then we have compound leaves. So this is a leaf with more than 1 blade, and all of the blades are attaching to a single leaf stem. So we have lots of leaflets making up 1 leaf. So this includes either a pinnate arrangement, so thinking about all of the veins of a feather, and then we have palmate, which is like, again, your hand. So all of the leaflets originating from a center position originally, and originating from the same spot. So pinnate compound leaves, a good example of that is ash. So all of the leaflets on the single stem coming together to make one leaf. And then for a palmate, a good example is a buckeye tree, which is what's shown in this picture here on the left. Okay, so moving on to buds, which is kind of the hardest thing. So if you are looking at the buds, just some vocabulary. So a terminal bud is a bud located at the tip of, I do not like how that sounds, located at the tip of the stem where the plant growth occurs. So this is at the very tip. And then moving on to a leaf scar, this is where if a leaf falls off or is broken off, this is the marking that's left. And then a lateral or axillary bud is to the side of the terminal bud, and it can develop either into a new branch or into a flower. So buds can be in different arrangements as well, and these have what are called bud scales. And these are specialized leaves that surround the bud in certain plants. So they can be in different arrangements depending on what the plant is. So it can have no scales, one scale, two scales, or three or more scales. And three or more scales is what we call a shingled pattern, or sometimes it's referred to as imbricate. Okay, so let's move on to some trees. So first we have Japanese maple, or Acer palmatum. So it's called Acer palmatum because it kind of looks like your hand. All of the leaves are palmate, like we mentioned before. So the leaves are, again, simple palmate with about 5 to 7 lobes. And there are actually lots of different kinds of Japanese maples, but this one specifically has those 5 to 7 lobes. Some of them can even get up to 9. They have the really deep sinuses. It almost looks like a compound leaf, but it isn't. And they are serrated, so it has the teeth on the margins. And they're a very deep red color, usually, but you can get some in either green or yellow, but the red is my favorite. And the bark, so the tree usually has lots of different stems, so it's a multi-trunked tree, and it has smooth bark that's either greenish or gray, and it has opposite branching. So remember our MAD acronym, it's a maple, so it has the opposite branching. And the buds are very broad at the bottom and kind of form a cone shape, or what we call conical. And they can be either green or red depending on the color of the leaf. Okay, so next we have alternate leaf dogwood. So these have simple leaves as well. And they are oval in shape, and they have arcuate venation, so that means the veins of the leaf originate from the midrib and then extend to the front of the leaf. So it kind of gets like a drooping, like rainbow look on the leaf. The bark is smooth, and it has these dark green patches, and it eventually turns light brown with what are called fissures, or basically like stretch marks is what it kind of looks like. And these have opposite branching. So controversial to the name of alternate leaf dogwood, the branching is opposite, but the leaves are usually in an alternate arrangement, which is kind of confusing. And the buds are a small, deep red color, and they usually have 2 to 3 scales showing. Okay, moving on to magnolia. So there are lots of different species of magnolia, so I'm just going to be talking about them a little generally. They're all beautiful, and their leaves are simple with these wavy edges, and they have very large leaves. They're usually between 8 to 10 inches long, and the underside has whitish hairs on them. The bark is smooth and very thin. You can actually like push your fingernail into it. And it's gray and brown with these like small platy patches. And it also has, this one has alternate branching. The buds are very long, some of the longest buds really out there. They're about 1 inch long, and they're very silvery in color. It almost is shiny when you look at it. Okay, so all 3 of these species have kind of the same common diseases that affect them. So the first is called leaf or tar spot, and you've probably seen it before. It is a fungal infection, so these form circular, dark, or yellow spots on the leaves in mid to late summer. And then another common disease that you've probably seen, or I hope you haven't seen because it's kind of annoying, is powdery mildew. So this is another fungal infection that leaves the leaves looking kind of dirty. They have this white dust on them. And this is more prevalent later in the growing season. So for some treatment and care options for those 2 things, it's often effectively controlled by following good sanitary practices, and rarely a chemical control is needed. So proper care of these trees will really help preventing those 2 fungal infections from happening. So it's really important to rake and remove your fallen leaves from directly around the vicinity of the tree. For the purpose of pollinators, it's not necessarily the best thing to remove all of the leaves from your lawn, but just within the vicinity of the tree, probably like a 10 feet around, at least under the crown is what's recommended. And then proper watering, fertilizing, and pruning is also important to make sure the trunk is getting enough circulation. So it's important to remove crowded branches that might cross or rub together. When the branches rub together, this creates an opportunity for wounds to be created in the bark, which opens up the tree for diseases, fungus, all of that to actually enter into the living portion of the tree. And it's also important to remove the branches with narrow angle attachment. So this would be like sharp angles from the trunk. So usually anything less than a 45-degree angle is a pretty sharp angle, and that branch should be removed. So as you can see in this picture, it kind of shows good pruning practices. So you'll see they removed all of the broken branches and kind of just gave the trunk some room to breathe. And I also wanted to point out that some people just like to chop the top off of things, and that's often not the best idea. It creates this kind of clustering plume, if you will, coming out of the top. Okay, so moving on to a new tree. So this is swamp white oak, or Quercus bicolor. So it's called Quercus bicolor because the top of the leaf is very shiny and dark green, but the underside is very, very pale in color. So the leaves are simple and they're obovate, so they are kind of an oval, but kind of not. They're a little irregularly shaped when looking at the lobes. And they have large, irregular, blunt teeth. So like I said about the serration, so these lobes are very like shallow, but they're still considered those teeth. And like I said, very, very shiny leaves. The bark is very gray and scaly. It kind of reminds me of alligator skin. And it also has alternate branching. The buds are kind of unique. They're very short and blunt, and they're a very light brown color. They kind of match the bark in color, but what's really unique is they have these 3 thread-like stipules that come out of the end, so 3 little like hairs looking that stick up. And this is really the only tree that has those. So it's really easy to remember on a plant ID test when you see those buds. So some common disease for oaks is oak wilt. So this is a fungal infection caused by the Bracteria fusarium. and it affects only oaks in the red and white groups, which is very interesting. And I'm not sure they've quite figured out why. It's a fairly new thing that's being studied. The oak wilt grows through the tree's water system, so it will eventually kill the tree. So it's very important to try to prevent this disease as much as possible. So the leaves wilt and drop from the upper canopy first, and then continue down through the tree very rapidly. So you'll see these symptoms in June through September, but they're most common in July through August when it's hotter. And you'll see these very red, rusty patches that kind of look like the oak it's wilting, it's dying, it's turning this color that it would really in the fall right before the leaves fall off. So for treatment, once it's in a stand, it's very, very, very difficult to control. So it's really about preventing it from happening. And the greatest risk of transmission is in the spring and early summer, so April through July. And if the trees, so it's important that the trees needing to be pruned in April through July, you paint the tree with what we call a tree wound paint. So it, after you prune, you put this paint on and it seals the wound, so the wound can't be infected with any fungus or bacteria or anything like that. So I have our picture again of some good pruning practices, so making sure the trunk is aerated and there isn't those rubbing branches, so those wounds can't be created. And there's a picture of this tree wound paint. I've seen it in pretty much every hardware store, Tractor Supply, anything like that. So it's fairly easy to find. Okay, so moving on to river birch. So these also have simple leaves, and they are pinnately veined. So the veins extending from the midrib go to the outside of the leaf instead of, remember the dogwood that had kind of those droopy rainbows that go to the top of the leaf. And these are double serrated. So even their teeth have teeth, kind of like sharks. So the bark is very smooth when it's young, and it has these salmon-colored spots. And then once it gets older, it develops kind of a bark that can flake off and is streaky. There is no terminal bud for this tree. It's just the axillary buds. So the leaf will, when it emerges, it will emerge on top of the bud in the spring. And these are a very reddish color and very pointed. I've actually drawn blood from touching one of these buds. So some common diseases that affect birches. So we first have birch cankers, and this is also a fungal infection. So these cankers are formed when the fungus has become established in wounds. So I think you're probably picking up on a common theme here, that pruning is really important for making sure that these wounds are not developing in the trees. So for the cankers, there will be a horizontal slit showing in the surface that's kind of a deep orange color. And then birches are also really heavily affected by insects, like most landscaping plants, right? So aphids are a big one. If the infestation is severe, aphids will actually swarm to birches. And there's also a birch case bearer. So this is a caterpillar that mines the leaves and causes them to shrivel. So for treatment, the birches, again, like I said, they're very susceptible to borers, so preventative insect control is really what's recommended, so taking good care of your trees. So regularly monitoring, pruning, in midsummer to fall. and watering and using a birch tree fertilizer. So birches like to be trained to grow with a center leader. So that's the branch extending in the very middle of the tree. And that's usually taller than the rest. So that's why it's called a leader. And then removing the lower hanging branches is also really important. So you aren't knocking into it with a lawnmower or anything like that and creating those wounds. And removing all of the broken, diseased, and dead branches is really important as well. Okay, so moving on to balsam fir. So I'm sure you have probably all heard of this tree before, have it in your home around December. So these leaves are flattened and blunt, and you'll notice I still call them leaves even though they're needles. Needles are just a special type of leaf. They still conduct photosynthesis just like broadleaves do, which I think is super cool. So these needles are flattened and blunt, so they're not pointy. Most spruces have pointy needles, but the firs are usually quite blunt. So they're shiny and dark green above, so the top of the needle, and then very silvery blue on the bottom. And the bark is very shiny or silvery with these like gray, brown, reddish markings, and they have raised resin blisters. But they're not blisters, they're okay. It's just the way the tree is. And the buds are very reddish brown and reddish and resin covered, so they're very sticky, and they kind of look like very spherical mini raspberries. So balsam firs, they're pretty susceptible to disease if not taken care of properly. So the first, which I've received quite a few calls about, is needle rust. So this is a fungal infection, and the needles at the tips turn yellow or orange, or sometimes even a very deep red color. And the infected needles fall off in the fall, which is not characteristic of coniferous trees. Usually they hold on to their needles throughout all of the seasons. So the needles this disease often needs a host, an alternate host, usually a blueberry or willow or fern or something like that, to complete its life cycle, which is kind of unique. And they're also susceptible to specific types of insects. So one is even named after the tree itself. So the balsam fir bark beetle. So it has these long yellow hairs on its head mostly, but on the rest of its body. And it causes the bleeding of the sap from the trunk and the reddening of the needles with some significant dieback. As you can see in this picture, it can be quite severe. It can turn the whole tree bright red. So for some treatment and care for needle rust, treatment, it's usually effective by removal of the alternate host, but you have to determine what the alternate host is. So it's pretty easy to do. It will have the yellowing and other symptoms, just like the needle rust does as well. And then again, improve the air circulation around the tree. So with balsam firs, arborvitae, things like that, the branching can get really dense around the trunk. So it's really important to do that pruning and open up the trunk quite a bit. So the air can be moving through. And fungicide sprays can be applied when new growth emerges in the spring. But usually if you remove that alternate host and you're removing those branches that have been affected, you should be okay without the use of any chemical, fungicide, anything. So they can be pruned any time of year except for during extreme cold. So when the shoots have finished growing is really ideal. So late winter, early spring. And removal of the branches that meet in a Y, so there was those really tight angles is really important. And removing the branches that are dead or broken as well. And it's important to note for this type of tree to prune outside of what is called the branch collar. So this has the whorled branching. So a lot of the trunk, they come out from around the trunk from the same point. So you would want to prune the branches probably 3 to 5 inches outside of that initial meeting of the trunk, just so it isn't affecting that branch collar where most of that nutrients is flowing through. Okay. And then for the balsam fir beetle, the treatment, maintaining proper irrigation prevents successful infestation. So these beetles really like to target weakened trees. So if you're making sure that you're keeping your tree strong, you're preventing a possible infestation. So if you do have an infestation, pruning and burning the affected parts is necessary. So you want to burn these branches or drown them because you don't want the beetles to escape and go to a new place. Right, or infest the same tree over and over and over again. So removing the branches that are growing at tight angles again, and rubbing other branches. So we don't want to create these wounds and attract things to this weakened portion of the tree. And it's also really important to water regularly. So balsam firs kind of like a twice a week schedule in the summer. As it requires a pretty moist soil most of the time. But if there is rain, that counts as a watering. So if it does rain, you don't have to keep watering it. And next we have arborvitae. So there are quite a few different kinds of arborvitae as well, but the oriental version is what most of us have in our landscaping. So the leaves are scales, and they are overlapping, very flat. You can actually lay them on a piece of paper, and it will be flat on the paper. And the bark is very thin and fibrous. It kind of looks like horsehair on the bark, or on the trunk. Very stringy, reddish brown. And the buds so the younger twigs are flattened, and then once they're older, they turn around and hold these reddish brown resinous buds, very similar to balsam fir. So these are susceptible to a couple diseases as well. So the first is called sun scorch. So the combination of wind, sun, freezing temperatures, and lack of available water makes the leaves turn brown. So they're essentially drying out. So all the moisture is gone, the sun and freezing temperatures, the wind are drying them out, and it burns the leaves, it kills them. And then the next is bagworm. So the caterpillars feed on the leaves and twigs, it defoliates the tree, and they leave these long bags of tough silk hanging on the branches, and it causes severe defoliation. So for sun scorch, it's really important mainly to wrap your tree. You can do it with different kinds of plastic, but burlap is generally the best option. You can also cut off the affected areas, but it's really important to wait for at least a full growing season, just because you want to make sure that they're actually dead. Sometimes they're pretending. So it can come back, so waiting that full growing season before chopping those branches off is a good plan. And then for the bagworm, you can treat manually if the infestation isn't terrible. You can remove manually the bags and those caterpillars. But if it's too much, you can use a form of insecticide. And the tree will recover. It will take some time, but proper pruning of the diseased or dead branches and removing the branches from the higher density parts of the tree will open up for air circulation, and you'll be able to also see where the caterpillars in those bags are to hopefully be more diligent about removing them. And then our last tree, we have white spruce. So these also have needles. They look pointed, but they are not sharp. And the bark is a thin gray-brown with a flaky kind of flake-looking bark. And the buds, the needles, are borne on woody pegs. So it looks kind of like toothpicks. And they're sometimes glaucous, or meaning waxy or cloudy looking. So there are a few diseases for this one. So the first is cytospora canker. This is the most prevalent and destructive disease for spruces. It starts on the lowest branches and then goes to the top, and it turns the needles this purplish hue, and then they eventually turn brown and fall off. And then the next is a Rhizosphaera needle cast. It's very similar to the balsam fir needle cast that I was talking about. It's also a fungus, and in the first year of infestation, the needles appear mottled or speckled, and then they turn a purplish brown, and then drop prematurely. And this often starts in the middle of the tree. So for the canker, this is a stress-induced disease. So how do you fix it? You minimize the stress. So don't compact the soil. It's really good to use a 3 to 4 inch layer of mulch to make sure it's retaining moisture. Remove the infected branches. Don't prune branches that are wet. So this is very important because if you're pruning the branches that are wet, it can attract this fungus. And then watering in the dry periods, and especially late into the fall. And then for the needle cast, the treatment, so the spores are released from spring until fall. So avoiding working near the trees in wet weather is important. So chemical control is an option, but it's pretty intensive. So just taking care of your tree will hopefully minimize the need for that. And then care, removing the dead branches, fallen needles, and cones, because this can still hold the fungus. Pruning to promote better air circulation, and watering well and before winter.